It's a real privilege and pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event hosted by the English in Education SIG of BERA, English in Multi-Academy Trusts, the changing shape of the subject and its impact on teachers. A warm welcome to you if you're with us live, and an equally warm welcome if you're catching up on the recording. So the session this afternoon is being recorded, and so please, we'd just like you to be aware of that during the session. And we're particularly glad that you're able to join us at the end of a very busy day. We know that the holidays holidays are only just over, but they already seem quite a long way away, don't they? So I hope that you're well equipped with biscuits and tea and everything else that you need to fire you through the next session. Having said that, we've got a really exciting session lined up for you, and we hope that you'll be really inspired by it. So what we're hoping to do during this event is explore the position of the subject English within multi-academy trusts. We're asking to what extent English departments within multi-academy trusts have professional agency. We're asking to what extent English teachers within those departments have agency. And we're also interested in the relationships between multi-academy trust English curricula and policies and the learning of students. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, my co-convener, Professor John Gordon, who's going to talk a little bit more about the work of our SIG before we introduce our participants. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Lorna. And yes, good afternoon, colleagues. Yeah, I thought we'd just take the opportunity to make you aware of activities coming up in relation to the English in Education Special Interest Group. And the first thing to just make you aware of, if you're not already, is the upcoming English in Education Special Interest Group Conference, which is scheduled for early July, the 8th of July. It's a one-day conference hosted by Lorna and colleagues at the University of Bristol. And our focus this year is on the relationship between English, or what you see in the title there, Eco-English, and sustainability and climate change education, and of course overlaps with citizenship education as well. So if you visit the BERA pages, you'll find details about how to register for that event, and you'll also find details of our call for presentations and papers there around 4 broad themes. There you can see English and the environment, for developing change makers, the where and how of Eco-English with a focus on pedagogy and where those pedagogies might happen, and making climate narratives in English. So yeah, we're really looking forward to seeing the proposals that come in for that. We anticipate them being very varied and hopefully draw the interest of colleagues from many different areas, maybe not just those researching in English in education, but where there are those links to be made. So yeah, please do come and join us if that event's of interest to you. The other item I just wanted to refer to, I don't have details to share on the screen for this, but you would have seen through the initial presentation, just as you joined the session, the slides detailing the annual BERA conference scheduled for September of this year. And it's just to make you aware again that we have expect a good English profile there. We had 17 papers accepted with the English in Education SIG, and we have a trio of events focused on rethinking the curriculum in English, with a symposium specifically on the English curriculum, workshop about making or remaking an English curriculum, and a third panel event where again we'll make links across and beyond subject English to consider its relationship with other subjects in a whole school curriculum. So again, really looking forward to that, and hope many of you will be able to join us for that as well. But for now, I'd like to take us back to the schedule for this afternoon and introduce our first guest and speaker, Dr. John Perry. John's going to talk to us about the place, purpose and production of English in multi-academy trusts. John is an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, where he leads the programme for secondary English teacher education, and John also has wide experience as a teacher of English himself and as a head teacher. So yeah, we're absolutely delighted that John could join us today to share the insights of his research, which has been informed by his many research conversations with heads of English. So thank you very much, John, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone this afternoon. And I really just want to reiterate what Lorna said. We really do appreciate people turning up at the end of a long day, and certainly, yeah, the Easter break does seem quite a long time ago now, I have to say. Okay, so I'm going to start. I'm going to have a go at sharing my screen now. It all feels very 2020. It's a bit of a throwback, and I'm hoping that this works. It worked well in the practice sessions. So I will just get that, do the presentation. There we go. So the focus of my presentation, and I will talk for about 15 minutes this afternoon, is there on the title. It's the place, purpose and production of English in multi-academy trusts. I'm going to talk about 3 areas, but I'm going to talk about the third one more than the other 2. So the place of English, I think, is fairly secure. And we'll talk about that briefly. We'll discuss the purpose of English through the lens of pupils, schools and multi-academy trusts. And then I'll go on to talk about the production of English. And by that, what I mean is, how do MATs help to produce the English curriculum? And then we'll just round off with some very tentative next steps, things that I've thought about. Okay. I think it is really important that we locate this work in wider contexts of debates around teacher professionalism and teacher expertise in the country. I've been teaching in one form or another for over 30 years, and I've seen those debates take many forms. Over the past 10 years, we're in a fairly unusual space in some ways, in that the curriculum has been informed by a very particular ideological focus, and it doesn't necessarily represent everything that teachers understand English to be. And we'll touch on some of that as we go through. But it's also important to look at that in the wider school system. It's a system that we're discussing this at another event, at an English Association event last week. It's a system which the government itself has acknowledged is messy and often confusing. And this confusion can have damaging consequences for children, especially the most disadvantaged and vulnerable. And as teachers of English, I think we would all be very clear that if our children are unable to read, write, speak and listen to the extent that we would like, then their lives are most definitely, their lives will most definitely have damaging consequences. This system has evolved, like I said, over the past decade. That is the decade of academisation. I need to say now I have experience of that. I think Lorna or John said that I mentioned that I was a head teacher. I was a head teacher for about 6 years in a Cornish secondary school, and we went through the academisation process. Now, this presentation is very supportive of multi-academy trusts. My experience as a head teacher was very negative. It had an entire panorama program dedicated to the multi-academy trust, which took us over, and where the trust took over some schools in Cornwall and Cumbria, and it was a bad experience for everybody involved, I think. However, I think MATs have come on a lot. I think some of those early players in that system have moved out of that space, and I think MATs are clearly becoming very important, clearly very powerful. They are here for the foreseeable future, and I think they are evolving in really interesting ways, and we'll talk about the evolution of some of those as we go through. The context of the research that we'll talk about is I worked with a group of 10 heads of departments, heads of English departments, all working in secondary schools in ex-industrial communities of the East Midlands of England. Think red wall seats, think MPs like Lee Anderson, who if he is re-elected will be my MP next year. Think Ben Bradley, think people like that. Okay, these are schools which are very different to the kinds of schools which are often represented in the research, and I find them very interesting. They're the kind of schools I've always worked in. All of these schools were rated good by Ofsted, and they were all doing interesting things. All but 2 of them were in multi-academy trusts. The remaining 2 were local authority schools. A couple of publications have come out of this. If you're interested to read a little bit more about that, then I can forward those to you if you've really got nothing better to do with your time. So I shouldn't say that, should I? Okay. So we'll move on now, having introduced what we'll talk about. The first thing we'll do is just very briefly discuss the place of English. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. The national curriculum locates English as having a preeminent place in education and in society, and I think we would be quite happy for it to have those places. We wouldn't necessarily disagree with that, but we might disagree with some of the reasonings behind that, which takes us on to the purpose of English, or the purposes, I should say. Okay. For pupils, the research that I worked on, the heads of department were very clear that English really has 3 functional purposes, 3 purposes that they are particularly interested. The first one is a passport. None of the heads of English actually used that term, but several of them talked about English as a way out of their communities, as a way to employment, as a way to further study. It was a means to move on. It was a means to move on from their current situation, mainly, I have to say, through the qualification of English language they were mainly discussing, rather than the skills. But there was an element of cultural capital there as well. And some talked about literature. A couple mentioned that it's very important to have a good understanding of Dickens or Shakespeare. More of them talked about cultural capital in the terms of being taught to speak and listen in a variety of ways, so that they can work in different layers of society. But the heads of English, all of them spoke very powerfully, actually, about the social justice potential for the subject of English, that they were able to discuss issues such as homelessness, such as misogyny, such as racism, by choosing appropriate texts in the context of their schools. And this is very important for them. For the schools and MATs, it's a slightly different purpose, and it's a lot about the institutional reputation, particularly through the involvement of English language and English literature with Progress 8. Okay, it's about making sure that the kids get the GCSE, okay, in either or ideally both. It's about that day in August when every school gets the best ever results that they've had. Okay, it doesn't matter which school I've been in, every year every school gets the best ever results. So that's the purpose that the heads of English see English having for schools and the MATs. I'll now move on to talk more about the production of English, how the curriculum comes to be. Now, as I've said, my research focused on the roles that heads of English, who we might call middle leaders, the role that they play in curriculum production, whether that's in terms of deciding which texts are taught, which sequence of texts are taught, deciding on resources, etc. Okay. However, with the nature of the curriculum or the school system rather that has developed over the past decade, we've got to think quite hard now about what we mean by middle leaders. And this is being conceptualized by various people, and that Ainsworth et al. Have decided that in the wake of academization, middle leaders might be considered more broadly to be anyone who is sandwiched between different hierarchical levels. Now, it's quite an ugly phrase, that, sandwiched between, but what they are pointing to in this article is the idea that there are more layers than we have had in the past, that with the advent of multi-academy trusts, teachers now work with multiple layers. A traditional, and this is, I appreciate this is a very simplified model of a traditional school, the kind of school that I began to be a head teacher of. You have your teachers, you have your middle leadership team, and you have your senior leadership team. Yes, there are governors and there are the local authority as well, and you can add the government to that, and it's important not to forget those. But in terms of the day-to-day running of schools, that is a very typical model. Now it is more complex than that. We have those three layers still, but we also have what we might call a multi-academy trust middle leadership team, might be subject directors, and their senior leadership team, the chief executive officers, the chief operating officers. So we have a more complex system now, and so now a head teacher might be considered a middle leader. Okay, so we just need to bear that in mind. Thinking about subject directors, the experience of the heads that I taught, heads of English who I worked with, varied. So one, who I'm calling Helen, not her real name, clearly, says about her subject director, she's been brilliant. She's kind of the same, and she meant the same as me. She's almost a kind of knowledge base, really. She marks all the GCSE papers. She always feels like she's ahead of the game, like we need to do this. We maximize results if we do this. So this is a good example of a MAT supporting an academy, okay? And the subject director really assisting the head of English on the ground with really good advice. Other schools had different experiences. Emma was saying, we've seen two, they haven't lasted long, they haven't had a huge impact. Michael, in the same trust as Emma, says actually at the first meeting everyone was polite, we all politely said we'd do this, then we went home and did our own thing. Okay, the subject director was trying to impose a curriculum across all of the schools in the trust, but as Michael says, I'd carefully chosen what I thought was best for our students, and this is something we will come back to. So there's a form of resistance there when it comes into actual space, and it's a bad example of a MAT supporting academies. It was more like the idea that the school was there to support the MAT. Okay, and I think to quote the great Greg Wallace, this was where the wave of ambition of the MAT met the rock of reality of a very polite but very experienced head of English. So, however, perhaps more importantly, most of the heads of department didn't even discuss the MAT at all. So it's a very varied experience. It's a very varied picture. So thinking about the next steps, some work has been done about this. Toby Greene, our colleague here at the University of Nottingham, has pointed out very clearly that MATs and federations must learn to operate as both hierarchies and networks. And I think that's very important. They cannot work successfully as simply as top-down transmissive institutions. They've got to be networks for learning across the trust. Okay, we know that school leadership has a significant effect on features of the school organisation, which positively influences the quality of teaching and learning. So the leadership, and here I'm talking about middle leadership, whether that's subject directors or heads of department, we know their work is important. The question is, how are MATs learning to lead and then equipping their colleagues to lead learning? I think that's a very important question. We also need to understand how MATs and the extent to which different MATs are attempting to control pedagogy and content across their academy. And there is a whole spectrum of practice across the country. This is a very simple framework I've developed, or I'm developing. And if anybody wants to help with this, I'd be very, very keen to hear from them. I'd quite like to try this out with different people. So, ways forward. I would suggest we want to maintain the preeminent place of English, but it's really important that academies maintain the capacity to respond to the needs of their communities. Okay, MATs need to support academies rather than academies supporting MATs, because we need to remember where the pupils are. The pupils are in the schools, and this is a tension between a hierarchy and a network. And as in every presentation we ever do, further research is needed. Okay, we always have to put that in. Change is coming. The next 18 months are going to be very interesting, and we need to think, how prepared are we as people involved in the English space to manage and to lead that change? So I think these are key things to think about. Okay, there are some references. We have lots of geese at the University of Nottingham. We are contractually obliged to use a particular presentation, hence the geese, hence the goose rather. And if people would like to follow anything up with me, there is my email address. And I think that's about 15 minutes. Shall I stop presenting?
Thanks, John. Yeah, we don't want to stop you, but you're absolutely right with the timing. It's perfect. So yeah, thanks ever so much, John, for that fascinating outline of the structures that are often relevant and their implications as well. It's a great way to start our thinking and discussion this afternoon as well. I'll just take this opportunity as well just to invite colleagues as well, as we go through the afternoon, to add comments or questions to the chat. Obviously, after we've heard from each speaker this afternoon, we'll move into a more open discussion where our guests today will be able to respond to and elaborate their detail of their work in response to the points you raise in the chat as well. So please do begin to enter any responses to what John's shared with us there as well. Thank you so much, John. I'll now pass over to Lorna to introduce our next speaker.
Fabulous. Yes, thank you. So just to emphasise, we're not going to break for discussion between the presentations. We'll run through the presentations and then we'll discuss after that. So do make a note of questions either in the chat or jot them down, and you can put your hand up afterwards. So it's really lovely for me to be able to read the list of attendees here, because many people are like me. Many people have the absolute privilege of working with trainee teachers at universities, with PGC lecturers or associate professors, whatever. And so we're working on a daily basis with newcomers to the profession. And we, as part of that work, of course, we're in intimate contact with a number of schools. But I can also see that on the call, we've got a range of people who are in schools at the moment, working right at the chalk face or the whiteboard face, whatever the phrase is for now. And Caroline Creswell, our next speaker, is very much representing that community. So it's an absolute privilege to welcome Caroline. She's the English lead at the Joseph Whittaker School in Nottingham, but that school is also the lead school in the Trust, so she's also the English across the East Midlands Education Trust. So she's speaking to us this afternoon very much from the school perspective. So thank you so much, Caroline, for being with us and for the presentation that you're about to share.
Oh, thank you for that, Lorna. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am very much at the chalk face. I don't know if you can see in the background, but I'm in my classroom, So if anyone else has had a day of teaching and is here, congratulations. Please do use the chat box as much as you're able to during this. Today, I just wanted to speak a little bit about the role and some of the challenges that it presents as we move into larger multi-academy trusts, as we have that tension between the identity of the trust and the need for alignment, but also the desire to keep and preserve our autonomy, and quite frankly, to keep us as teachers in a job that we enjoy and to give us that development and that freedom as well. So it's a little bit of what I'm going to speak about with you this evening. Thank you all for your time. I've just got a little bit of research for you. As you can see from my role, that's not my specialism. I'm very much still in the classroom. But one of the challenges that multi-academy trusts face is the development of a central leadership team. And it's something that lots of us have found throughout our careers. Perhaps we began in a standalone academy or a standalone school even, and now we're part of something much bigger. We've always been part of a wider network as teachers, and it's why we love our job. We're doing something bigger, but this has become something that influences much more our day-to-day life and our freedom within the classroom and the identity of our school than perhaps it was 10 years ago. And it does remain that the greatest challenge for a MAT is deciding which structure they're going to adopt, how they're going to follow it, how they're going to develop, and make sure that all of our stakeholders, from our staff to our children, are getting what they deserve for being part of that community. And some of the dominant trends that we found was that a multi-academy trust tends to internalise their functions. So in days gone by, you might have an SLE from the local authority. Now everything is much more in-house. And this presents lots of challenges for, I'm focusing on my role this evening, but for subject directors, as more and more is expected, rightly so, of us, because we are often the only point of contact and the only sounding board. This does bring with it some challenges, because tasks which previously would have been completed entirely by the head of department, decisions which, as John's alluded to earlier, would have been made entirely by the head of department and their team, are now being influenced increasingly by the centralised team of which I am a part. And specialist roles like mine have evolved over the past few years, and it tends to be a luxury of a larger trust. We found that smaller trusts tend to have, it's titled here, a catch-all role. They might have one person in charge of English across every key stage, every setting. They might even only have one person in charge of teaching and learning across the whole trust. So there's quite a big difference depending on where we're situated. And Ambition Institute have identified this. Our role is always to deliver school improvement, but there's two ends of the spectrum in terms of the models that we adopt most commonly. One which actually foregrounds preserving the autonomy of the individual schools, and the second, which is a much more centralised model, focused on achieving consistent teaching and pedagogy. This isn't always curriculum alignment, but often that's where we might tend to find it. And perhaps I might argue that the two are not exclusive. My trust preserves the autonomy of the school, but we also want consistent teaching and pedagogy, because great teaching is the same components in every session. It's interesting to look at the role a subject director plays in preserving the identity of the trust. I have little influence over the identity of my trust as an organisation, but I do influence it on the ground. And I work for the East Midlands Education Trust, and part of their mission statement is that we're a partnership of willing, proud and autonomous schools. And in reality, what this looks like is we do not have a centralised curriculum. It is not necessary for all of our schools to follow the same exam board. We have 13 primary schools who have a primary school lead and the role of the subject director, although we work together. I don't have influence over that other than transition the bigger pieces of work. 9 secondary schools, all in very different socioeconomic contexts, and 1 alternative provision. So if we're thinking about developing our staff, just by being in a trust, we have a phenomenal pool of resources and educational experiences that are open to us, and it's my role as the subject director to facilitate as much growth within that pool of talent as we can. It's interesting to hear John speak about his research when he spoke about the colleague that said we came in, we were very polite, and we went away and did our own thing anyway. That always tickles me every time, and it made me think, how would I feel if one of my colleagues did that? And actually, I imagine quite positively, because we are all moving in the same direction. So whilst I may make a suggestion about curriculum, or we might explore an avenue, there's no requirement for them to follow exactly. The only exception would be if we've got a school that's underperforming, and then the role shifts and it becomes almost, it is very much a critical friend, but my liaison then, and as is the case for lots of subject directors, is often SLT led rather than directly with the head of department, which is a real shift in dynamics and can present some challenges to overcome in terms of relationships as well, particularly when you're not all based in the same place. In terms of support, if there's anyone for whom this role still seems quite abstract, it can be everything from strategic support, curriculum, underperformance, organisational, particularly if we have a newer head of department as we have currently, pedagogical development of staff, but also broader. And I think something the role provides that was absent before the introduction of multi-academy trusts is pedagogical development for heads of department. In my view, my most successful heads of department meeting was when one of my team is absolutely phenomenal, said, gosh, I love these afternoons. I just really get a chance to think. And she's like, it's like the old days when we used to have the network meetings. And there really has been a gap that's been created by exam boards moving to more remote and virtual training, budget constraints, that actually is very important, that the data is always important, but we have to feel fulfilled in our role and part of something bigger. And in my mind, a subject director is doing that when we feel part of a community rather than part of a programme. You know, you still have your freedom. My question for you, which I'm hoping it is going to get some of the comments going in the chat section, and I'd like to give you a minute for, is, does a subject director need to be in the classroom? Obviously I'm in mine now, but is that actually necessary for a subject director to still be teaching a substantial timetable and to still be leading their own department? If I'm going to mute myself for a couple of minutes so I don't keep talking over you, but if you could respond in the chat with your initial thoughts about that, I'm really interested. I can see a couple of people typing. Thank you very much for that. If we can keep that coming through throughout the session, they'll be great to come back to at the end. I think wonderful. For me, and my identity as a subject director, as well as my identity as a teacher, I don't think it's possible to be the kind of subject director I want to be and not to be in the classroom. We speak a lot about the tension of the dual role. So my role is 3 days in-house at my home school, teaching 12 out of 15, and then 2 days working across the trust. If we're thinking about academies and trusts creating something bigger, for me it's so important for my credibility to be able to have to come back to my classroom and to understand the reality of the changes that are happening, and actually the reality of implementing those changes. It's very easy if I step away to think I would like XYZ finished, and I think if I weren't in the classroom I would lose a little bit of my empathy perhaps for that. And I think I can imagine lots of people nodding at the screen, but as English teachers, often our workload and the subject specific challenges aren't always appreciated by members of senior leadership, because it is so unique, and our subject is so unique. It's really interesting. I've just seen something pop up about teaching across lots of schools. I would agree with you that there have been times where my role has required me to step in and you know, feet on the ground. We've got a problem. I'm in for the next, you know, however long, and it's challenging. But after you've done it, the relationship that I now have with that team, not just the head of department, but the team as a whole, is my strongest, because you're able to prove yourself. I know you shouldn't have to, but when we think of our senior leaders, you often develop a new level of respect when you actually see them teach. And that's the thing that unites us, isn't it? That's the magic. That's why we're here. It does bring me again onto my next point. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. But location and context, and does it matter? John spoke about his study earlier, focusing on a very specific geographical location. We are East Midlands Education Trust, which brings a new dynamic to the role, which wouldn't be present if we were more geographically diverse. And I feel that I need to just pause at this point and say there's absolutely no criticism of different models implicit in what I'm saying. What I'm hoping to show this evening is my own experience and some of the discussion points that it raises, which perhaps then you can take away to your own settings and use as drivers for change and for improvement, because nothing makes you happier as a subject director or a head of department or a classroom teacher than someone catching you or dropping an email and saying, I've got an idea about this, or have we thought about this, or have we ever used our subject director in this way? We've got game time coming up, can we get them in? This is really what we're looking for. I think if, like me, you are based in an area which is geographically close, I love that about my role. I love it. I have very, very strong ties to my community. It's very important to me in terms of my personal identity, to teach where I grew up and to serve my community, my former mining community. And across our trust, again, if I'm thinking about credibility, the fact that I'm not teaching in a school which doesn't face behavioural challenges, or which doesn't have significant numbers in those focus groups that we all struggle to improve our outcomes for, is really important. It's also shaped our curriculum, because one of our schools decided to look at local identity within their Year 7 curriculum. So everything based around it had Nottinghamshire landmarks, Nottinghamshire writers, particularly working class writers. And the way that that spread across the trust was really exciting and was very unique to every setting. We have a school in Loughborough that's very ethnically diverse, whereas my home school is not. It made schools think about diversity in a much broader sense rather than just ethnicity. And it's really enriched the curriculum. And I think for me personally, the fact that we are close geographically is really important and creates a sense of community. It allows us to do things like work with the university and work with John in a way that's a lot easier just organisationally to facilitate as well, which is really, really fantastic. If I think about my role again and the role more generally, one of the biggest challenges for subject directors is building a community of their heads of department within the community of the schools, within the wider community of the Multi Academy Trust, and then within the broader landscape of teaching nationally. And I think real successes come in building these communities when the agency remains with the department and with the head of department. Again, that is not to criticise trusts who adopt another model, and had we more schools in our trust who were struggling, who needed that really kind of rapid improvement and standardisation and everyone, sorry to be colloquial, but singing from the same hymn sheet, I can really see how a drag and drop as a first stage would be very beneficial and would provide immediate improvement in outcomes. But I think when we're thinking about the role of a subject director, it's all about what are you building. The immediate is what are you doing, but the long term is always what are we building? How are we making something different? What are we leaving behind? And the tension that we alluded to earlier between the centralised model and the autonomy. I mentioned that for me they're not exclusive, because I do feel that centres can have agency and control within a certain framework. But for us, the exam boards being different, there are only 2 across our trust, that we do not all sit the same A-level courses. That's not a requirement, different specifications. We don't all do the same texts. And I think that's another strategic decision that we've made as a trust that allows us to build that community, because my heads of department know that I want to play to their strengths. Most of us are AQA, a couple are EDUCAS. If I've got a senior examiner for EDUCAS, there's no benefit to the children in altering that exam board. It would only benefit me, and that's not the role of a subject director. As I say, it's about building and moving forward. I'm conscious of time, so we're nearly there. But if you're thinking perhaps about the chat box, I'm really hammering it today, but please, because they're big questions to think about, because really it's like, who are we and where were we going and what are we creating within whatever framework we're working under. And some of the future challenges, I think preserving the autonomy of our schools with the creation of national resources, like Oak National, for example, has been a huge development in the past few years. And I think subject directors staying true to their subject rather than having a teaching and learning lead due to budget constraints, perhaps, or a desire for that to be an entirely out of the classroom role and the budget allocation being that way. I certainly think that's a real challenge for us. and it then makes us question as teachers and leaders, what will that actually mean for us in the classroom if the dynamics of our organisation change in such a substantial way? Where will I go to fill the void? Where will I go to feel part of a community? I'm going to pause there. Thank you so much. I'm all right for time on time. I wasn't too bad, was I, Lorna?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Caroline. That was absolutely fascinating, and you've made us really think about the difference between that centralised curriculum giving schools autonomy. You've made us think about the place of a subject director and where are they best day to day, week on week, depending on the challenges of their role. You've made us think about how MATs embrace diversity and support their local communities through that. You've made us think about that really crucial difference between the doing and the building, and that's a lovely image that I will take away. So thank you, and colleagues online, please do jot any further questions or points in the chat for Caroline, and or note down something for discussion later. And just before I pass back to John to introduce Andy, I've just happened to notice, and I love the fact that John Perry introduced his presentation at the beginning with lots of alliteration on P for Perry, and Caroline, you had introduced your presentation with lots of C's at the beginning there, C for Creswell. So I'm just wondering now whether Andy's going to use lots of A alliteration for us. We shall find out. So I shall pass over to John Gordon now to introduce Andy properly.
Thank you, Lorna, and again, thank you, Caroline, for introducing those themes of community, identity, agency, autonomy, all of which I'm sure Andy will talk a little bit about as well. So yeah, we're delighted again that Andy can join us, Professor Andy Goodwin. Andy is a professor at the University of Bedfordshire and also an emeritus professor at the University of Reading. Throughout his career, Andy's been involved in English education or English in education and related research, and in various roles, of course, as a teacher educator, senior roles in universities, and key roles in various networks, so the International Federation for the Teaching of English, and also, and until very recently, also as a co-convener with Lorna and I for this group as well. Andy's work has often addressed issues such as teacher expertise and teacher identity and their interaction with, if you like, an ever-changing and contested discipline, the subject of English, themes which I'm sure Andy will elaborate now. So over to you, Andy. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, John, for the generous introduction. I've got to start, however, with a couple of apologies. The first is I can't do anything about my extraordinary sort of halo effect. It's just I'm sitting in a strange room in a different country doing this presentation, so I kind of have to make the best of it. So sorry if I look a bit strange, can't help that. And the second is because of where I am, I probably won't be able to stay around for the whole of the discussion. I will probably have to go after about 10 minutes, depending on how long I go on my topic. So sorry about those logistical things. The third thing I'd like to say before I share my screen is that we've heard some really interesting two inputs, which have looked at the complexities of the multi-academy trust model, and the word challenge has come up many times as well. My particular interest in research is very much about the English teacher in the classroom, what I'm going to call, and I mean this in a very, very deliberate way, the ordinary, extraordinary English teacher. All those people that Lorna and John are working with who are going to become English teachers have the potential to become expert English teachers, no question about that, except if they join multi-academy trusts, they probably won't. So I'm going to have to say why I think that. And my presentation, I'm going to be straight from the beginning, is far more critical of the multi-academy trust model than we've heard so far. And I think that's useful for the intellectual debate that we hope will happen in the last few minutes, or will continue after this three-way input is completed. So I want to make it very clear that I'm going to mostly be critical in ways that I hope explain why I think that the ordinary, extraordinary English teacher has a really, really difficult job now to have agency or autonomy. Whatever thing about the middle level and the big hierarchical level, the individual teacher is at the moment, I think, in a really difficult nexus, much more of control and much less of autonomy. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now, I hope. I did it very badly earlier, but I'm hoping I'll do it better this time. I don't think it's shared yet. I think I'm having this trouble again, unfortunately. Try and get that menu to work. Aha. Right. Can people see that? Can someone confirm you can see my screen or not?
All good, Andy. Thank you very much.
Ah, good. Thank you very much. All right. So my title, you'll see, is This Was Sometime a Paradox, helping English teachers to spend less time on thinking about teaching. And that's a paradox I want to explore as we go forward. I'm just presenting my abstract, which I hope you've read, just to remind you that I am taking this quite critical stance on particularly two things. One is, as I said in my introduction, the role of the individual teacher. And the second is the idea of English as a curriculum, which is a dynamic kind of living curriculum, or to use John Dixon's phrase, a quicksilver subject. It doesn't do well if it's over controlled and channeled. It does much better if it's diverse and flexible and continually reinventing itself. So scripted lessons and PowerPoints provided centrally, I think are, I think they're disastrous. But the argument is they stop teachers having to do lots of work. So it's a really awkward paradox, that one. I came at this work through my research, which combines, that's just a bit about me, if anyone wants to know more about me. So I came into this research because I'm very interested in the idea of things like lead practitioners, that being a model of an individual teacher who is recognized for their quality as a teacher, and their main role tends to be to support other teachers at the level of the classroom, not necessarily to support the head of department. I also want to point out in a moment that it's become more and more difficult, I think, for those people who move up the hierarchy in English to actually be like an English teacher in the way they think. And that's about the structuring nature of the larger multi-academy trusts, which are also, of course, geographically not at all community-based. They are literally, and I mean this in both senses, all over the place. So the structure of the talk is, I'm interested in things about structure and agency as I'm a critical realist in some ways, but also this kind of, there's a phenomenological perspective here about what's happening and why, and what the kind of momentum of what has been happening leading to what's going to happen really is a kind of phenomenon. Because when we did have a system, we don't now, which is the local authority system, we also had some things like, say, the advanced skills teacher, which were a nationally recognized way to develop expertise in teachers and to share and spread that across the country, but locally based, always within a local authority type role. So that knowledge of the local was always there, as well as that knowledge of the national, which was a really good balance. I think multi-academy trusts must be considered fundamentally a neoliberal conceptualization of schooling, however well-intentioned and however effective some are, and some trusts I think are extremely supportive and powerful. At the other end of the spectrum, they're exactly the opposite. They are like enormous corporations with very expensive senior teams, and they are all over the country, and they're not planned in any meaningful sense. I think that has to be accepted. They simply happen to grow. So they are, as it were, acquisitive. I mean, it's never, there are some very large academy trusts, and they then have this enormous challenge of to what extent do they have an identity, and to what extent do, say, English departments retain what Caroline was talking about, which is some autonomy at school level, some local choice. Well, I think some of these approaches are exactly the opposite. They do not want local choice, and they do not want English teachers, as I'm going to say some more, spending too much time on their own thinking. They want them to have a sort of corporate approach to those things. So the lead practitioner was, I came in, I thought, oh, what's that going to be like in a multi-academy trust? Because there isn't a particular model. There are all kinds of shapes and sizes. So what is a lead practitioner there? And before I go into that, we do have to draw on expert teaching models, which are really a global phenomenon. Here's a short list of a number of them. So the lead practitioner came almost spontaneously, I think, into being in the vacuum left by the advanced skills teacher. If I've got time, I'll talk a little bit about the chartered teacher, which has started to become a model in this country, but it's tiny. I mean, it's the tiniest thing. Advanced skills teachers, there were at least 5,000 or 6,000 of those at the height of their positioning, as it were. And those models are important because we know English is suffering now from not only a decline in popularity as a subject for students, but it always has a bit of a problem with getting a more acute recruitment and retention problem. How do we keep those excellent teachers in the classroom if they don't want to be in management? How do we have teachers who can foster, nurture, mentor, whether it's student teachers, beginning teachers, or experienced teachers? And there are a lot of teachers out there now who are suffering from the fact that working in an academy is not very enjoyable. That's just a fact, as my research shows. I'll talk about that in a moment. So an alternative career structure to management is really important for keeping good teachers happily teaching. And English was very good. There were an awful lot of English advanced skills teachers who thoroughly enjoyed the 80% in the classroom and the 20% helping other teachers, to called outreach. Most professions have something like this kind of lead practitioner, lead exemplary professional model. So I thought with the lead practitioner, it might help the academies to have still people whose job was to be independent thinkers and advise teachers how to be independent thinkers. So I've kind of talked about this, but so if you talk about the fact there's not much of a system, if you look at the DFE website, I haven't done it for a few months, so this may be out of date. It only contains about a page about the lead practitioner. In other words, it's not a recognised role in the way that the DFE recognised advanced skills teachers, or later on things like SLEs and things like that. It is kind of grown in a neoliberal way, a kind of market forces way, without having any kind of central definition. Now that might sound like good flexibility, and I think in some cases that can be true. This is kind of what they refer to as what they think a lead practitioner should be. This is generic, so it could be of any subject. You'll see, it's about leading improvement in teaching skills, some kind of leadership role. So that kind of follows on from the advanced skills teacher quite well. So the research was done starting off through NATE. I'd begun by just looking at what these roles were described as, and the term lead practitioner was the most popular, particularly in the three big subjects, as it were, English, maths and science, but it's in many others. But there's a whole variety of names, I won't go into them now, which leads up to a role like director of English, which didn't used to exist, but has become a part of the neoliberal kind of vocabulary, really. So most of this research is based on 11 semi-structured interviews, recorded, transcribed, analysed. Took quite a long time because it was during COVID. I've been to some mats, I've visited other schools, I've talked to people, so it's enhanced by ongoing questioning of the role and questioning of how English is emerging as a subject in the contextual way mats operate on English. So yes, these are some limitations. I'm the only person who's analysed these transcripts. I do well-defined views about what I think is good English. So they all knew that. I told them that. I met some really outstanding people. They'd all been classroom English teachers. They now are at different levels of role and title and had different views. So there's not some neat outcome to this. I would like to thank them for their participation, especially during COVID. They all talked extensively. They really opened up about what's going on. They gave me very honest accounts of the situation and the scenarios that they worked in. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And I just said to them often to tell me about, and they would talk extensively because they're really passionate people. I didn't agree with some of their views at all. And that was part of our conversation. And, you know, they were very sometimes evangelical, you might say, about the way that a trust could, using things like lead practitioners, have a really strong culture. That could be very good, but I think there's some issues around that too, which I'll come up to. But English, yes, as John was saying, particularly, you know, does still remain the kind of key subject, and they're very aware of that because they were working across schools and working with other either lead practitioners or directors, and frequently the key thing for any school is the literacy and the kind of areas where they can improve language understanding, so that feeds across into other subject areas. It has a really high a high profile in each school. It's actually in many trusts quite well resourced, even abundantly so. So there's no shortage of materials, and some schools were very well staffed. Others had quite more ongoing challenges, and that preeminence of the subject I didn't find was contested very much. It was kind of, well, English comes first. So they're working in a really, if you like, but in some ways a strong area of the curriculum that's recognised in schools still as absolutely key. What I think you can say about the notion of things like a lead practitioner, at the very lowest level, simplest level, it's a retention position, so that they keep a good practitioner in a single school, and that person becomes a bit of an advisor to other teachers, and that's very useful. I interviewed one or two of those. It can be a single school role, therefore, in the department, a single school role in the department, and a whole school role at the same time. So some lead practitioners of English are also, say, literacy or the teaching of reading, so they have a wider role. And then it could be a multi-school role in a small trust where they might be working with 4 or 5 departments. Again, those would tend to be geographically, close to each other. But then there's quite a big jump then to something like director of English, executive director of English, and there could be many, many schools. And there that person has a kind of very hierarchically defined role where they are, and they say this, in charge of a large number of departments, in each of those departments is something like a lead practitioner, and that job can be very much to make sure that there is this idea of consistency for pedagogy and materials, so that at its worst, I think, everyone is doing the same thing pretty much at the same time all through the school year, and the director sees that job as making sure that English is the same everywhere, and their argument would be therefore it's equally good everywhere. At the bottom of that hierarchy is that English teacher who is experiencing a curriculum mostly defined by others, mostly thought about by others. They're not going to those nice meetings that were mentioned by Caroline. They're getting CPD within the trust, and it's very much about this is the way we do it here, and the best thing you can do is fit with it. The role has many strands. I mean, many of them very positive, coaching and supporting teachers, advising, doing CPD, helping with initial teacher training, observation, feedback, curriculum design to an extent, some performance management, some school improvement. So it's a really interesting role to have, and it varies very much whether it's what I'd call an enabling role or a more enforcing role. And several of them said it's a grey area. One of them said, I was introduced when we had a new leader of our multi-academy trust, he and another teacher who was, I think, director of science, the new CEO said, you're the ambiguous ones, as in, where do you exactly fit in our senior leadership role, and are you one of us or not? I think that was the implication. Strongly at its best, it's a critical friend, trusted advisor, and some of my interviewees talked about how much they valued the fact that they had built these communities of trust, as Caroline was talking about, and therefore they could be a critical friend, and that was accepted. But they also said, a couple of them said, and both used this phrase, They think of me as the smiling assassin. I'm the MAT enforcer, and I'm the one who's reducing all this unnecessary thinking and saving their time. And my job is to align the curriculums. And when you looked at Align, it's a bit stronger than Align. Really, it was kind of uniform. Turn it into a uniform model and make sure that every school is doing it on the basis of the idea that we know best, and the individual teacher, particularly the younger beginning teacher, doesn't know much. Okay, well, how do they learn much? How do they get to know much? My argument would be they're not going to learn much or become very good at English teaching, because in a sense, the unnecessary thinking, the necessary thinking, which is one of the real pleasures of English teaching, is not their opportunity. It's not their right anymore to do that. And I think that is a really significant problem for English teaching longer term. Here are some good things about it. Most of them were engaged with Nate, for example, which is always valuable. Though I think they thought of Nate as a little bit like an old auntie who perhaps has had her day. Didn't particularly mention something like Vera, but then I didn't go into that territory very much. But this point, the fourth bullet point, little attention to individual teachers as an agentive element. I think that, GCSE was monolithically powerful in the way they felt it had to be implemented. And there really was a huge thing about Key Stage 3 really mostly being just about GCSE. They all said it shouldn't be, but then the reality was pretty much that's what we've got to do. So one of the features of the research, talking about it as a researcher, is that I had these very detailed and elaborate transcripts, which are really interesting. And again, thank you to the participants for the way they very eloquently often express themselves. But also, when you look at them a bit more holistically, they reveal to me huge confusions and contradictions. On the one hand, saying English is the best subject to teach, and because of its dynamics and the importance of literary texts, and at the same time saying sort of, but we can't have too much individuality about it now because we've got to get those results. And absolutely, I guess, insoluble dilemma, unless you think you trust the individual teacher to make sense of that dilemma and run their own classroom in a really agentive way. So I'm just going to quickly show on the screen and then stop because I see the time is gone. A couple of lengthy extracts of people just talking about the job and what they're doing. This one is about curriculum alignment. So I'm not going to read it out to you. You're all excellent readers, so you can just take it in very quickly. If anyone wants to get some more of these quotes, I can happily send them to them. And this emphasis on things like booklets that all the teachers across the whole trust would work with. I think I've got time to show one more and then I'll stop. Well, actually, one more, I think, because I want to quote from there. So I won't go down to my conclusion page because I'm taking up discussion time. So to sum up, I think the serious problem is expertise, and that one of the unintended consequences of particularly the larger multi-academy trust is that the individual English teacher is really losing an identity and losing a sense of curriculum interaction, control, development, lesson plan and design. The whole notion of localizing is in some areas alignment strips out the local. So I think we also have a bit of a crisis for English teachers in the future about what the nature of being a professional English teacher will be, particularly if you don't want to go into management, but you do want to manage your own classroom. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for those teachers to feel any real sense of autonomy or agency. And I think that is long term a really worrying outcome. Thank you very much, everyone.
Many thanks, Andy, for sharing your research and the thought-provoking data, as well as your interpretation of that too. Yeah, really good to hear that. And I think what's striking about your data as well is that, the many different perspectives it represents. Yeah, some of them critical, some of them quite complimentary about the structures they worked within. And so I suppose that takes us now to our discussion as well, where we'll be able to hear from other colleagues joining the meeting and again get a sense of different perspectives. So I'll pass over now to Lorna, who will chair that discussion. But yeah, thank you, Andy. I don't know, Andy, if you're able to remain with us for a little bit of this discussion or if you have to leave now. Oh, sorry, Andy, I think you're on.
Yeah, I can do 5 minutes, John, just 5 minutes.
Great.
So if anyone's got a really burning question for me or riposte, sorry to be rude to John and Caroline. If there's someone who really wants to ask or challenge me, which would be good, I'm here for about 5 minutes, and I'm very happy to take a question straight away, and then I'll leave the rest of you to just have the full discussion.
That's great. Let's do that then. Thank you so much again to Andy, and thank you to John for passing over to me. I'm going to be chairing the discussion, but you don't want to hear my voice. What I want to do is to invite other people to contribute, and I'm particularly interested, given that we've heard Andy's view on subject leads as smiling assassins, and we've heard Caroline as a presenting her very collegiate model of being a subject lead. So please, yes, could I invite somebody to either raise their hand or to just very quickly jot a question in the chat for Andy before he disappears, and then we'll open up to a broader discussion with other colleagues for the last 15 minutes. So Ali Goddard-Jones, who's local to me. Welcome, Ali.
Hi, yeah, local to Lorna. Thanks, Andy. Thanks for your presentation. I was just thinking about what was said previously by Cressida in the roles as English leaders within MATs, and you were talking about reducing thinking time. And one of the things, I am a MAT leader for English, and one of the things I think I'm always trying to do is create thinking time through networks and the sort of larger scale work that we can do across MATs in that way. And I understand the criticism completely, because there are lots of pressures to maybe try and make things easier. How can we make this easier? How can we reduce the stress on teachers for managing change and managing workload? So there's a bit of a push in that way. But I think I would like to think I hold at my core enabling thinking time rather than restricting thinking time. So I just see that as a bit of a dilemma, really, for myself professionally, and a reflection on the things you were telling us. It's not really a question, it's an observation.
Would you like to respond to that, Andy, before you go? Thank you so much, Ali.
I just say that, as I said, I mean, the data I've got reveals all kinds of modes of attitudes about how you help teachers. Almost everything is well intentioned, and the idea, for example, of providing everyone with a PowerPoint and everyone with a scripted lesson, and everyone with a little bit of space within that to do their own thing, it certainly does reduce thinking time. It might even reduce stress and everything else. But I fundamentally believe, and I think you do too, that it's necessary thinking, and there has to be both opportunity to individually think and design lessons, collectively to think as a department, and then nationally to think through NATE or through network. I mean, one of the things which is a strength of some of the trusts is they've got kind of their own English networks. I mean, in that way, I think that's very good. Only trouble is when I ask about something like NATE, where you'd connect right across the whole country, it's kind of it's a lacuna. They're not even aware of NATE very much because it's not talked about. I mean, one of the things that's happened to NATE, this is my last comment, one of the things that's happened to NATE in the last few years is its role as a provider of CPD has almost disappeared. And almost all CPD is either exam boards or multi-academy trusts. Now, it may be excellent stuff, but it's much more positioned, right? What's the point of exam boards CPD? Well, it's to make you part of the exam board. I mean, an exam board is a private enterprise, Something like NATE, I will say, is a public-spirited, open-ended place where teachers can meet and talk about whatever they want to talk. So that growth mindset, that ability to become flexible and capable, that's my real worry. Again, however well-intentioned it is in a big trust, it's very difficult for that individual teacher to feel they have any real say in what goes on. Mm-hmm. And on that fairly depressing note, sorry, but it does come out of the research. I will say thanks very much, everyone. I'll leave you to it, John and Caroline. Sorry to leave to deal with it, but I have to go. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Lorna. Thanks, John. Thank
you so much, Andy. Thank you to Ali for your question. John, is there anything you would like to say in response to John and Ali's points?
Is that me, John, or John?
Sorry, yes, I do meant, I apologize, John. It's John Perry, as our initial speaker. So to go back to you and your research that you shared with us at the beginning.
Yeah, I think, I mean, and Andy seemed to think he was being kind of rude towards me or Caroline in a fairly jocular way. I certainly don't feel that at all. I would disagree with very, very little of what Andy was saying. I think from my research, because it's done in the context of these a very particular context, ex-industrial communities, there are, you know, with the mats that the schools were involved with were actually in many ways more typical of most of the mats in the country. Most of the mats are actually quite small. Most of the mats are not these enormous, you know, Paris or this Outward example. And I know with Outward, for example, I know, yes, it is a massive mat, but it is broken into smaller regions, each of which has its own identity, and try to keep geographically located. And I think that's one of the things that Caroline was trying to say, is that when you have the geographical connections, when you have the ability for teachers to meet face to face at some stage, then that is really, really powerful. And I think we really need to remember the diversity of multi-academy trusts. And John was sorry, Andy was definitely saying this. We can't characterize them as one particular thing. It's a really complex picture. Like I began my presentation with, the government has said the system, you know, messy and confusing and damaging for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils. It's not a great system. We could be doing, you know, if we were designing a school system, surely this is not what we would envisage. It is where we are at the moment. So I think we do need to recognise the kind of diversity of mats. Most of them are actually run by schools. Most of them are fairly cognizant of the context of individual schools, but I think there are problems when they do try to impose a brand and so on. The beginning teachers we work with, who work right across the East Midlands region, we work, you know, many more schools than the ones I worked with. The students come back with a variety of experiences, and some tell us how disappointed they are that they do have to present a particular lesson. The PowerPoint is there, they have no negotiating space whatsoever. They have to deliver what's on the slides. Most of them, however, that isn't their experience. Most of them, they do have some agency to adapt slides, and several they you know, helped to create slides and lessons in the way that you know, in the not too dissimilar to the way that I did many years ago. So I think there's a whole variety of practice. The problem for me comes as we look forward to when this generation of teachers becomes the next group of leaders, and we have a new school system, an evolving school system, and whether or not they have the skills either to lead change in a successful way. And those particular leadership skills, I think, are very particular and are not necessarily kind of shared effectively from multi-academy trusts with their colleagues. But also I think that's subject knowledge, and I think the subject knowledge is absolutely vital. And I think there is a concern if we spend all our time just preparing pupils to pass the exams, because those exams will change, the curriculum will change. You know, it might not change as quickly as we would like, but it will change. So I think we have problems coming down the road.
Brilliant.
That probably rambled on more.
I'll pause
than
you there,
hoped.
John. We've got some brilliant questions
Yeah.
coming up in the chat, but that's a really great point. Thank you. And it's back to the doing and the building, isn't it? And the difference between the doing and the building. I'm going to combine two questions now. Thank you. So thank you so much to Vicky and to Becky. And I'm going to put this question to Caroline first of all. The questions really are concerning how bodies external to the MATs can support the MATs. So how might NAPE support MATs? How might the English Association support MATs? How might higher education institutions, such as the universities that are represented here this afternoon, support MATs? What is it that MATs would want, would hunger for? Caroline, you mentioned earlier on that you give, that your heads of English really appreciate pedagogical development, for example. Help them think and to ensure that they are part of the community. What is it that external bodies can do?
I think that's a really interesting question. I could feel from reading it, or perhaps I'm projecting there, perhaps a fear or a concern that as MATs continue to grow, it will marginalise those sorts of organisations. But I think any forward-thinking MAT organisation, standalone academy, or however they choose to structure, I can't understand why you would ever stop looking outwards. And when you're thinking about the need could change so drastically from one year to another. Like within a school, 3 or 4 key staff go. Let's say you have 2 of your heads of department promoted and 1 moves to a school outside of the trust. All of a sudden, your need is completely different to what you started with in September. I think what we enjoy about our relationship with John and the university is the fact that, and I imagine it's what we would still value about any other organisation, is that however progressive your multi-academy trust is, what that gives you is freedom. Even something as small as the organisational capital of it not happening in-house is massive, sort of mentally for people, and for, as was mentioned earlier, of giving people freedom and creativity. Because naturally what happens when you're all working together, this is wonderful, and we build and we develop and we generate, but then you reach a point where you just need to get out. You need to see something different, you need to hear something different, you need a different person in front of you. And I think certainly that strand will always be there, even despite the rise in popularity of things like the research ed conferences and such. And I think actually what we're looking for is the research. We want to stay cutting edge, don't we, in our classrooms? We want something new, something fresh, a better way of doing something. And I think perhaps tied that in with one of the earlier comments about progress. And if progress comes at the cost of the holistic child and organisation, is it really progress at all? I think that institutions like that are so important in keeping that wider picture. There's often a tendency to think that if I go for an out of trust or out of school training, it's not going to add value in my classroom, and that's just not true. Our responsibility in-house is to share that expertise. And actually there is value sometimes in a colleague just being able to go somewhere for an afternoon. What's 2 hours across the course of a year? For someone that works so hard for you every day and so hard for your children. And it just, I think it keeps, sorry, I'm thinking as I'm going, but it keeps the prestige of the profession, actually. This connection that we have with research, and it's so important to our identity as teachers because we are experts in both our subject and our pedagogy, and if we don't nurture that and feed that, then again there's a time and a place for booklets, but I wouldn't welcome that. You know, I wouldn't welcome that as a model.
Of national, you know, of academy trusts impacting on retention. The question doesn't really suggest whether the questioner suggests that the impact is going to be positive. In other words, MATs are going to keep more people in for longer, or the contrary position. Interestingly, I'm just involved in some research which is about the impact of the core content framework and the early careers framework. So on very recent new teachers. And unfortunately, there does seem to be a pattern in the people that we've been working with, that they feel inhibited, they lack the opportunity to be creative and agentive, and very sadly, that means that they're leaving almost before they've started. So, John, I'll pass that to you first, if you don't mind. So, what do you think is the impact of MATs long term on on keeping teachers in the profession? And then I'll ask Caroline briefly to follow up. So just quick answers, please, because then we'll have just enough time to ask one more question too. Thank you.
Sure. So I think it's difficult to extract what is the influence of MATs on teacher retention from the influence of the wider kind of educational culture. And I think it was Andy in the chat who talks about the research showing that schools who aren't in MATs are also sometimes implementing very strict curricular models, if I'm reading your point correctly. And I think this is where we have to see it all as part of this wider education system. I think while there is evidence, I have read some research which says that the ECF is having a positive impact on some beginning teachers, and it is making them feel more satisfied with the previous kind of iterations of that sort of level of support. That's not my experience of working with beginning teachers, and I'm seeing more kind of coming to me for references a couple of years after they've started teaching, but references for jobs out of teaching. And I think if the system was working well, we wouldn't have a teacher recruitment crisis which we are in the middle of right now. I'll stop.
Thanks, John. Caroline, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I agree. I think it is the system, and you find often when people, before they make the decision to leave the profession, I would encourage anyone to try something different, try a different setting. Just make sure that you're choosing to leave the right thing, you know, for your own well-being and your own happiness. I think there are some people, although I'm not among them, who would say that some amount of staff turnover is indicative of improving standards. I think there are some trusts who take that approach, particularly when they sort of take over a new school. That's definitely not how I see it. And I think it's difficult to separate MAT initiatives from Ofsted initiatives, which I think is also what you're alluding to, isn't it? The curriculum documents we've had have seemed to prioritise sequencing, just seems to have got out of control. And I think that does a lot to staff well-being, because when people don't feel they can even select a different poem to teach, you know, in a unit of work, you can't do 20 years of that. It's not what we're trained for, is it? There's no joy. And I think perhaps sometimes the role of a MAT is also, as well as standards, to provide people with opportunities for excitement in their classroom, because it's the best place to be, isn't it? It's magic. And I hope, I don't know, sorry to go a little bit Dead Poets Society on everyone in the but you know, all of these other things, you can sort of tune them out and minimize them if you've got those moments of joy every day in the classroom.
Please don't apologise, Caroline, because I think that's an absolutely wonderful note to end on. Moments of joy. We're on this call because we live and breathe and wish for moments of joy to permeate our professional, our teaching lives. And let's hope that maths can be part of that, and that students can be impacted so positively as well. We are out of time. I can hear the bell on the Wills Memorial Building in Bristol chiming the hour. So it just remains for me and for John to thank Caroline so much, John Perry so much, Andy Goodwin in his absence so much, Dan at BERA for organising the event for us, everybody for their engagement and their questions on the call, for contributing to the chat, and for being here. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Have a fantastic evening, and we look forward very much to engaging with you further in future BERA events.
Thank you.
Thank you.